Hello guys, my name is Fhirda Melani and today I'm going to present about the history of English literature from 18th century until 21st century. 18th century literature. Based on British literature, timeline states that this century is the time of Enlightenment, the age of reason, when all branches of science were developed and resulted in great technical progress. In this era, many events occurred such as the erection of Alexander Pope's memorial as a monument to Sir Isaac Newton, then announcing the extraordinary intellectual virtues of the scientific innovators of that era. The characteristic of the work in 18th century varied widely start from Jonathan Swift that used his black humor and irony in one of his works. Drama that written from the London stage in the first half of the 18th century is classical and modern tragedies, comedies, pastorals, burlesques, and adaptations of foreign plays. Some poetry also served to expose lies or reserve values. The relationship between man and woman reduced by social convention to a battle in which beauty is weapon and reputation defense. The poem served as an engraving which a contemporary quote captivates the mind of most people of all ranks and conditions, from top quality to most violent. Also, many writers who exemplify through their works, such as in engravings that map the different worlds of the employed and the apprentice, also hint at the exaggerated degree of arrogance of his quiet industrial model. The famous author in 18th century is Jonathan Swift. His most famous work is Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World, familiarly known as Gulliver's Travels. Next is Romantic literature. Romantic era formed by the influence of revolutionary upheaval in France. In this era, the revolution in France was a new dawn for mankind, also defined as being negligible in various ways, being challenged, entered, debated, or simply questioned by writers who are not necessarily swimming against contemporary currents. This period was more open to conflicting interpretations than most others. It is an age clearly shaped by the influence of the revolutionary revolution in France. But if neutrality is difficult to maintain at the time, avoiding taking sides or silence or withdrawal of commitment should not be interpreted as an inability to read what we loosely perceive as a sign of time, or as a failure to respond appropriately to a predetermined political or cultural harmony. In the Romantic era, writing, thinking about, criticizing, and defining literature was very diverse and different. Literary work in the Romantic era deals with political anxiety and focus on the problem of class perspection and the nature of oppression. Godwin was less concerned with state authority and more with the exercise of a relatively small but no less destructive power by the privileged class. The famous author in Romantic era is George Gordon, Lord Byron. His famous work is The Prisoners of Chillon. His work is concerned with the freedom of the individual as well as nation. Next is High Victorian literature. The High Victorian period was an age of conflicting between explanation and theories, scientific and economic beliefs, and social and spiritual pessimism, and shaped awareness of the inevitable progress and deep anxiety about the nature of presenting. A large amount of Victorian intellectual effort was spent trying to piece together the exploding universe. One of Dickens' work also shows the characteristic of the era. He makes novel diverse, perverted, and generous. Importantly, They reflect the nature of urban Victorian society with all its conflict and disharmony, eccentricities and boundaries, energy and extraordinary fertility, both physical and intellectual. Based on timeline of literature period, reflected a changing social, political, economic, and cultural climate, and also it affected by industrialization and technological advances and recurrent issues including poverty, class, gender, religion. Based on British literature timeline states that a high Victorian period the writers described English society with all its character became the most popular literary form. The famous author is the Bronte sisters lived in isolation in North Yorkshire. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte were two of the most original novels of the day as they were very fresh and unconventional. Next is late Victorian literature. In the 19th century, medieval Victorian morals belief began to sound oppressive, even humorous and science. Even Oscar Wilde scoffed at the idea in the title trivial comedy for serious people, the importance of being earnest, and Samuel Butler chose earnest as a Christian, the intellectual and morally flabby hero name of the way of a flash. Literature from the last 20 years of the century deals with extended and various discourse that attempt to re-evaluate the assumption of the 1850 and 1890 and for implication of the new concept of liberation and evolutionary development. Thought Queen Victoria, the embodiment of maternal honesty, reigned until January 1901, and though the final years of her reign seem too patriotic observed to mark the pinnacle of national and imperial glory. Victoria's personal and social values, beliefs, and standards of behavior have been challenged, sometimes angrily, by a new generation of intellectuals and writers. English fiction in the last 2 decades of the 19th century was too often been seen as being dominated by works of the fine demanding expatriated Henry James and by novelists fight by James as good little Thomas Hardy. Late Victorian fiction may express doubt and uncertainties but in aesthetic terms in display a new sophistication and self-confidence. Thomas Hardy's fictional world is one that lacks the comfortable shape and contours of the old technology. History appears in Hart's work as a partial realization of universal consciousness and as a process misunderstood by both conventional historians and by romantic speculative poets. The 1890s saw the emergence of the so-called New Woman, educated, individualistic, but still not fulfilled by the fact that she continually submit to men. Through the entire range, the fiction is the Hardy women are not metropolitan writers or university educated campaigners, but they are generally appears as more determined and more sophisticated than his male character. Most novelists from this period retain the realist mode, so the adventure or fantasy and mystery format also came into their own during the 1880s. Social satire continued to be a popular genre.
Edwardian literature. The Edwardian period was mostly known for its elegance and luxury among the rich and powerful in Britain, but also for more moral looseness than there was in the Victorian period, and its failure to prepare for the challenges of the 20th century. King Edward VII's brief reign seemed like an idyllic fall, an era of international peace, internal security, and relative prosperity. The golden age of King Edward's reign wasn't always an illusion, but of course just a reality relatively privileged. Despite the Edwardian era being one of the shortest periods in English history, it was still a very strong and influential period in English literature, as it, in opinion, create a base for modernist literature to come to life. Edwardian novel writers make their readers think positively in the hope that they will turn out to be better than the cruelty of mankind. The overall picture of the Edwardian era is an era of luxury and change, in which the extravagant and reckless lifestyle and arrogant nature of the aristocracy and nobility succeeded with the civil rights and independence movements of socialism,
Modernism, and its alternative literature. In November 1910, the eyes of London gallery goers had been opened wide to the blazing colours and visual fragmentation of Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin at the exhibition organized by Roger Fry of Manet and the Post-Impressionists. The exhibition, such as the Sandal, was changed the course of British painting in the 20th century. Although the press had been vituperative and mocking in its criticism, and some visitors had laughed convulsively and shaken their umbrellas at the canvases they found offensive. In this era, especially in 1912, a second post-impressionist exhibition introduced the visual economies, the rethinkings of form, and the abstractions of Matisse, Picasso, Braque, and Derain to a London public. This second exhibition also includes somewhat tamer pictures by English imitators, notably Duncan Grant and Virginia Woolf's sister Vanessa Bell, and a sprinkling of work by Russian artists. A Russian contributor to the 1912 catalog noted the significance of a new generation of national painters who had assimilated themselves to the popular art, rejoicing in its sincere directness as a counterweight to what he saw as the over-refined and effeminate taste of the aesthetical gourmets of St. Petersburg. This comment related New Russian painting to the most familiar Western realization of the Slavic Renaissance, the season of ballet of opera, organized in Paris and London by the Ballet Company. Despite its reputation for being strict and insular, pre-war London had courteously emerged both as responsive to aesthetic novelty and as a focal point in the international dissemination of an art which seems as distinctively modern as it was innovative. The outbreak of his hostilities in August 1914 brought an abrupt, if temporary, end to easy international exchange and to expensive and overtly Germanic public displays in opera house. A sense of fragmentation, which was as much geographical and historical as it was cultural and psychological, haunted the experimental text of the 1920s. The old continent Paris had been confused, and in the case of Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, posthumously in dismerit. This era was characterized by a break with one's self-awareness of traditional writing methods, both in poetry and prose fiction. Modernists experimented with literary forms and expressions. This literary movement was driven by a conscious desire to reverse traditional modes of representation and express new sensitivities to its time. Next is literature in 20th century. Next is literature in 20th century. Based on a book entitled The Rothschild Story of Literature in English by Ronald Carter and John McCrae, states that a tension in writing between the popular and the esoteric, and the popular and specialized, the commercial and the avant-garde became a feature of 20th century literature. Isolation and alienation, together with experimental forms of expression, came to characterize serious literature, while cinematic techniques and the elaboration of popular genres came to dominate other forms of cultural expression. To some writers, the alienation they felt and depicted was an exploration of the individual sensibility in a world which it was felt was becoming ever more standardized and uniform. An age of the masses. The 20th century saw more and more of this broadening of artist trends extending into the other cultural forms of radio, television, cinema, and popular music. Some writers reacted to the situation by concentrating on a narrow, highly educated audience who would understand their alienation from this changing world. Thus, the avant-garde era in writing began. This intellectualization has been criticized as restricting literature to a cultural and academic elite. However, this tendency has been balanced by other writers who have made use of popular forms in order to communicate with a wider audience. Literature in 21st century. The defining event of the first part of the 21st century was the attack on American targets, including the Twin Towers in New York. The attack had a huge impact in every sense, emotionally, culturally, politically, all over the world. Imaginative response to it went through stages of shock, grief, anger, and assimilation. In the history of literature in English, writing by women was considered a practice most would now consider offensive. Many of the major writers of our time happened to be women, just as many happened to be gay, or born outside Great Britain, or whatever else might distinguish and characterize them. Many male authors have also happened to write well about women. Female-led novels in the 21st century are just as likely to reach a male readership as a purely female readership, and they are just as likely to involve genre crossover as anything by a male writer. Hilary Mantel has been one of the most successful novelists of the period. She had a very productive career before her 11th novel Wolf Hall won the Booker Prize. Thomas Cromwell had been seen as a very powerful figure until now. His novels, later successfully adapted as plays and for television, allow him to speak in his own voice, filling in enormous amount of personal, intellectual, and political background as seen from the viewpoint of one of history's most influential but ignored figures. In the 21st century, published works by contemporary writers who helped shape critical opinion on 18th, 19th, 21st, and 21st century American literature. Many notable writers of so-called serious fiction have also written crime novels such as Julian Barnes, John Banfield, J.K. Rowling, and Susan Hill among them. Poetry has flourished in the early 21st century, with some poets becoming very significant public figures. Many are, of course, tuned into the changing vibe, but poetry often distances itself from the quotidian, probing the internal values, although often from the stimulus of actual present-day event. Seamus Heaney, after winning the Nobel Prize for the Literature, became the most visible poetic figure in the entire world in the early years of the new century, consolidating his reputation as the greatest Irish poet since years. He's looking back into the past, which was so much part of all his verse, took the vital new form of major translation of such works. Since the turn of the millennium, there has been a flourishing in new drama, for the theater as well as for television and the cinema. Drama has had something of a golden age, despite precision and cutbacks, and it flourishes in tiny fringe streets as well as in the established London and provincial centers. More perhaps than poetry or the novel, drama has been able to resonate more immediately with the vibe to give voice, verbatim and otherwise, to the urgent social concern of the new century. That's all for me. Thank you.